Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in another episode of Parcel Monitor's Unpacking series. My name is Xiamin, and I'm the lead at Parcel Monitor, the leading platform for e-commerce logistics insights. With our studies and together with industry experts around the world, we hope to provide our community members a platform to acquire knowledge and exchange insights about retail, e-commerce, and logistics. So, there's been a lot of talk about data, big data, innovation in the field of logistics and supply chain. But what does it really mean? So what are its practical applications and how do companies go about getting started? Today, we're extremely excited to have with us George, Head of New South Wales Supply Chain, Retail and Agriculture at Telstra, to unpack for us how companies can drive data-driven innovation in their supply chains. George is a global business leader and entrepreneur with over 25 years of experience in online retail and information communications technology, and comes with great expertise on innovation, technology, and supply chain. So very great to have you, George.
Thanks very much for having Jomin.
So without further ado, I think I've talked enough, so let's get these sessions started. So George, hope you're ready. Usually this question of ours is the favorite of mine. It's a bit of a twist to your usual introductions. So George, could you introduce yourself to our community without using the word logistics or supply chain?
You're right. That is a bit of a twist and tricky question. But look, my experience, as you mentioned, I've had 25 years experience working predominantly in the IT telco industries. And for what I really do is work with those companies both in Australia and globally around improving their operational efficiency. And so, look, really what we're focusing on today is data, the importance of data for organisations and how to use that data across organisations. And in this particular industry, there's so much that can be done. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of those insights.
Fantastic. I think that was a great answer. Thanks, George. Okay, so now let's dive into the meat of the session. So data. So maybe to just ease things up a bit and get our audience familiar with all these terms. So could you tell us a bit more about what is big data and specifically supply chain data, and why is this data important in retail and for retailers and logistics companies?
Look, absolutely. And I think all of us on this call would have heard of the term big data. It's not a surprise. It's an industry term that's been about for probably 10 or 15 years now. And look, it all emanated from the start of the social media and the consumers and the collection and the use of data via obviously the connected internet. For organisations, obviously, we're taking it a little bit slower. And the reason is because it is more complex. And really, this is the big challenge for organisations today is, will you be a company that moves at speed and understands the big data? And will you be the ones that become most efficient and use that data for improving and optimising your businesses? Because those organisations that take that approach will definitely be the leaders of the future. And this data is not just text and information that we collect, but it's also now moving into areas such as images and video. And this is where it's becoming incredibly exciting around what we can do, analysing that data and utilising it across an organisation.
Thanks, George. And I'm looking forward to unpacking more of these terms that you mentioned, specifically on, of course, how can companies utilize all these to reach their business objectives, which is also my next question. So knowing about, how important big data is, how important supply chain data is, so what role does logistics data really play in achieving these business objectives? And so what is the key benefit for retailers and logistics companies then?
Yeah, look, absolutely. There's a huge range of different areas to focus on for organisations. Productivity improvements internally is one of the big focus areas, but also you are able to open up insights around customers and better improvement in targeting those customers. But where I'd really focus the discussion point is around 6 key areas: supply chain visibility, and I'll talk about that later on this morning. And that is a critical one because it's not just about your internal organisation, it's about what's happening externally as well. The other big ones internally to focus on are demand forecasting. How can you work with sales? How can you optimise those sales? It's about the warehouse, your inventory management, your asset utilisation, understanding that and making intelligent decisions based on all this information and the moving parts within your warehouse. The fourth area is around your team and your employees and how to improve and how to use and share best practices, how to improve compliance and how to improve workplace safety by potentially looking at videos in the warehouse, people being overstressed, overworked, improving that warehouse, that safety. And lastly, the topic which is becoming more and more concern for all organisations is sustainability. It's absolutely key. There's so much data out there, and it's an important point that we need to focus on with big data.
Got it. And from what I'm hearing, of course, George, what logistics data can do is, of course, help you make better decisions, help you improve, and help you identify some bottlenecks or some problems that you wouldn't have known if you didn't look at your data. And speaking of concerns, right, and something that we always hear, especially in this industry, is something about supply chain visibility. And so from our knowledge, it seems to be one of the top few concerns amongst logistics and supply chain professionals. So how does this notion of supply chain visibility actually relate to data? And what are some of the challenges in this regard?
Look, and thanks very much again, Jamie. So as I alluded to earlier, supply chain visibility is really one of the biggest challenges that needs to be addressed within the supply chain logistics industry. So obviously, we all know about making an order on an eBay order, and we can track our individual item that comes all the way from one country to the next, and we can see that easily on our phone. Now, obviously, we know the concept. If you're dealing with thousands and thousands of suppliers and items in volume, it's not so easy just to open up your phone and have a look at those particular applications. So tackling this is one of the biggest areas that we're looking at the moment, and it's about improving that productivity. So it's understanding about the sales data. How can we connect a retailer and the sales information that's happening instantaneously back to the manufacturer so they have visibility, they know, and they can understand the demand forecasting? Would be one example of how we can make some improvements here. A second one would be around tracking our logistics suppliers and transport suppliers. It's moving overseas, it's moving in shipping containers, it's moving on freight lines over the countries and over the land. Is how do you pull together all those various suppliers and have a coherent view about where your stock is, when it's going to arrive, and potentially where are the bottlenecks. So as Telstra, one of the things we're doing is helping out in that logistics area and trying to pull together a number of different suppliers to help coordinate that information. And organisations are taking many different approaches to this. So untackling and unbundling this is going to be a very important piece for organisations improving their productivity.
Thanks, George. And from what I'm hearing, it seems like supply chain visibility, in order to tackle this, it requires the joint effort of many different stakeholders in the supply chain, and it's not something that an organization can handle on its own, because you have to talk to your suppliers, you have to talk to your manufacturers. So, yeah, what do you think?
Look, you're absolutely spot on there. It is a web of thousands potentially of different suppliers that need to be brought together in that data. And look, for an organisation, this can be extremely daunting. Having those relationships with all of the suppliers may not be that easy. Some, it may be easy where you are an important customer. Others, it may not be so easy. So the advice that the approach that we generally take is start small. Start with one of your key suppliers or key retailers that you're working with. Understand and work out how you can access that data. So start at that sort of level and then start building it out as you see the benefits, because going in for an holistic approach can be challenging as an individual organisation. It's targeting those specific areas to improve your efficiencies.
Got it. Thanks, George. So now that we unpacked a bit on the data side of things, logistics data, supply chain data. So now going into, of course, the topic of the session, so data-driven innovation. So George, in your words, so what is a data-driven innovation, and what is the best way to drive data-driven innovation for organizations?
Yeah, look, absolutely. Data-driven innovation, bit of a tongue twister, or DDI as we sometimes call it, is really about accessing and using the data, right? So it's now we understand there's a challenge, but how do we go about it? A key facet for this, as the headline grabbing AI or automated intelligence has been the one of the methods of what companies use to make sense of this data and expose the data in a real way. However, AI is probably at the very, very top end. There are some simplistic areas where you could first focus in terms of utilizing that data. So, be it machine learning, predictive analytics, they're the steps that you can take, those first steps before you get to that AI. And it's absolutely critical you start small and build out over time as you prove this within your organization. The other key piece around data innovation is what you do within the organization when you're implementing a particular use case. So yes, it's a little bit around that AI or machine learning, which I mentioned. It's probably, reports are suggesting around about 10% of the effort or 10% of the focus. The next 20% is focused on the platform itself. So the cloud infrastructure, the security behind it, the two-factor authentication, so you can access those dashboards or provide those insights to employees across the company. But lastly, and most critically, the reports are suggesting that really it's about embedding these processes within your organization. So it's the cultural change which makes up 70% of the success factor of data-driven insights and innovation. And so taking that line is, okay, great, how do we change our organization is the most critical piece first. The technology is there to support that.
Great, I think that was very insightful. You covered basically the different facets of what is required in driving innovation, right? So the technology, which includes the infrastructure, also the cultural side of things within the organization. So George, do you think in terms of all these different facets, would culture be the hardest thing to achieve for an organization to get started in data-driven innovation? What are your thoughts?
Look, it is absolutely one of the key facets to get a business into that new mindset. It's about saying people, yes, they're critical, but let's change the roles they play within an organisation. So it's no longer sitting down, doing the Excel spreadsheets, building big PowerPoint packs, presenting these to executives. It's about saying, how can we start giving the executives information in a dashboard, or the user of that information in a dashboard they can access on their laptop, on their phone, or whatever medium they need to access that information. And it's backed by the smarts. So the machine learning, the AI, that becomes the intelligence when it's been programmed the right way. So getting that organisation on that shift into how to use that data is absolutely a key facet.
Got it. Thanks, George. So now going to, I would say my favorite question, because it's interesting to always know some success case studies. So next question is, okay, so now we know a bit more about data-driven innovation and what it can bring to organizations. So George, could you give us some examples of companies who have successfully applied this, and what were some of the outcomes achieved?
Yeah, look, there's a huge amount of work going on, particularly with the companies that I'm working with here in Australia and New South Wales, large retailers and large supply chain and manufacturing organisations. So look, they're using the data now more effectively across organisations. So where we're helping them is to help identify the data they've got, what is the data which is most useful, and then drive it into some of those use cases I said. So, it really depends on the organisation. Are they trying to tackle a warehouse and inventory management problem? Are they trying to create improved forecasting, which seems to be where a lot of organisations are starting, is how do we get that sales information and how do we get that quickly in terms of back to the manufacturing team so they can start ordering and building the products that they need. So without going to specifics of those particular company names, we're definitely seeing a lot of activity and a lot of improvements that have been made by organisations.
Thanks, George. So in terms of improvements, could you maybe share a bit more on, would innovation be something that you do to maybe increase your revenue, or is it more like a cost-cutting measure? So what kind of improvements did you see in terms of application of innovations?
Look, it could be both. It could be both, absolutely. A lot of organisations are focusing first on the efficiency and the efficiency gains to improve what they do. One of the key areas, as example, would be deliveries. Obviously, deliveries to consumers now at home has increased significantly, particularly with the rise of COVID and online shopping. Obviously, had a massive spike. So it's how do we help delivery companies be more efficient and do their route optimization? Very simple stuff. If you can throw in a whole bunch of different batches of where goods need to go, might be across a whole bunch of different drivers. It's what goes where to which truck, and then what road do they take to be more efficient. Look, other areas which you did mention around, not just revenue, but it's also things like fraud management. You can start to pick up customers that are calling into your organisation. Are they likely to be committing fraud, or are they potentially victims of fraud? And so using big data, you can start to create some patterns and pattern matching to help you understand what's happening in terms of your customer base as well. So a bit about the customers, it's a bit about improvements, and absolutely a lot of this can also help flow down to revenue by picking up trends and patterns of customers, understanding what they're looking at on a web page potentially, and so to start forecasting that demand more efficiently.
Got it. Thanks, George. The fraud use case is particularly interesting because, that's definitely a big topic right now. And I would say here in Singapore, fraudsters are getting very creative, especially on the e-commerce side of things. So, great. That's something that big data can help potentially.
Absolutely.
Solve.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we talked a bit about, of course, the different applications, the different case studies. So let's say I'm really excited to get started right now. So what would be the advice from you for companies that are getting started on their data journey?
Look, absolutely. I think I sort of touched on it earlier, right? Firstly, we've got that 10, 20, 70 rule. Keep that in mind about what you're doing, but start in baby steps. Don't sort of try to go out and solve the world to begin with. Start with a small proof of concept, understanding and looking at a particular problem that you've got within your organisation. So map out all the different process journeys you have, understand potentially what may be able to be automated. Nice and simple process there that can be automated and made easy for your organisation. So identify that use case and take the baby step. It's and keep probably the other one for the CFO. The little recommendation tip is try to do it on the light cost burn, because any big project obviously has a lot of expectations on the outcome. So again, that's why we're keeping it small. Test it, reiterate it, going with an agile approach, not just a set outcome. And then that should deliver the results you're looking for to expand it further.
Thanks, George. I think that's great advice. I think especially in any kind of new thing that you want to test, it's always good to start small, start a proof of concept, and then get a buy-in once you've proved it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so George, actually, I'm particularly curious about something. So when you talk about big data, right, and you mentioned it a bit earlier on in the previous question on how you help these large supply chain and retailers in data identification. So because big data, you're talking about a lot of different data, right? So in terms of the data cleaning, data acquisition, would that be something that it's a challenge for a company that is just getting started or on your data journey? What are your thoughts?
Look, my thoughts are generally most organisations have this data and it's accessible. Well, it's available within the organisation. So getting that data or having the data in the first place is generally not the challenge. The challenge is this data is held in a bunch of different systems around the company. So being able to find that data and where it is and how useful it is probably the first challenge that needs to be solved. So typically what organisations may do is they'll create a new online version in the cloud, one of the various cloud providers to store that data, and that then becomes a replication of the data you have in your organisation. That's probably the first step to understanding. Then the next step is accessing and using that data, because it is in a forum which is a little bit easier. Is where most customers generally or clients generally head to as the first couple of steps. Once you've got it in an easy, usable format, you're able to then start massaging it and using and applying the various AI or ML technologies to understand what that data and the data insights are. So, but one thing we need to focus on is there is data which is more considered the static data, and then there's the live data. The live data is obviously much harder to utilize because you're using on the fly and interpreting on the fly. So generally start with that more static data that's been stored already.
Great, got it. Thanks, George. I think that's great advice. So if you were going to start on your data journey, start with something small, and of course, look at your data. The data is always there. It's just how you're going to make it accessible, massage it, and use it for innovation applications. So now we're reaching the end of the session. And George, we know that you're actually speaking at an upcoming event. So maybe for our audience, could you give us a sneak peek into your session at the Supply Chain Planning and Logistics Summit?
Look, thanks very much. I mean, look, I can't tell you everything because you need to be there on the day, and it's critical that we get obviously as many people along to meet and network, and that's something that we have been so deprived of over the last few years. So absolutely encouraged to meet you there and have a discussion. But look, this is just a little bit of a sampler about some of the topics that I'll be reviewing on the day. It's really going into this topic into more depth to help an organisation understand what they can do with that data and where they can take that data. And it's really about, we have this Industry 4.0 concept as we've evolved. The question now is, what does Industry 5.0 look like? I think it looks like a convergence of the OT stack and the IT stack and the ability to be able to access this data. This is where we're going to drive improvements for organisations. And this is why companies need to really take it so seriously and start that first step in the journey.
Really looking forward to it, George. Sounds exciting already. So thank you so much, George, for joining us today with Parcel Monitor. Really, really nice to have you.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love this topic, and I love working with clients to help expose and understand what this all means for them, and look forward to hopefully meeting some of you on the day.
Exactly. So if you didn't catch the previous question, so George will be presenting at Accolade's Supply Chain Planning and Logistics Summit on 31st May at Sheraton Grand Sydney Hyde Park alongside 40 plus leading supply chain experts. So join your peers for this must-attend event, and tickets are still available, so book via Accolade's website. And of course, don't forget to follow Parcel Monitor on our LinkedIn page for more events where we unpack e-commerce logistics with industry experts like George. See you next time.
Thanks very much.